Fixing something for tonight?
I don't know yet. I might buy something.
Okay, you both of you back. All right. Okay. Feeling better? Well, we missed you. I had the COVID 2 weeks ago. I wasn't here. I didn't come.
All right. Well, we'll get started here this morning. Welcome you to the Mission of God class. Before we start, Tim, would you mind lead us in an opening prayer? Yeah. Yeah. Patterson's.
Spread the wings.
Yeah. That was quick.
Dear Heavenly Father, we bow humbly before you, recognizing that you are God, that you are worthy of all praise and honor and glory. God, you have blessed us so richly to live in a country where we can come together and worship you without persecution. And there are so many around the world who are hiding in cubbies to be able to come together to worship you. Lord, we pray for them and pray for those that are helping them. Lord, pray for those who are looking for you. Lord, we know that you are the rewarder of those who diligently seek you. You will, in your time, make things all right. Lord, we come before you this morning with a heavy heart. The Patterson family is suffering grief over a lost one. She's come home to you. And we just ask that you give the Pattersons peace and just comfort them in a way only you can. God, this morning as we all gathered here today, we just ask that you be with each of us. But as we think of those who weren't able to make it because of either health or other circumstances that kept them away, we ask that you protect them. We know that you know every single case individually. Lord, we are blessed that you are a God who knows us intimately, knows everything about us, and can help heal us in every way we need. And all you have to do is touch us, and it's healed. We are in awe of that greatness. Lord, we ask that you be with our elders and our deacons and the ministers today as they are trying so hard to continue to work in your kingdom and further your kingdom here on earth. Lord, we ask that you be with Matt as he leads us in this word this morning, and just open our hearts and minds to the word that you have for us. It's all in Christ's holy name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Tim. We're picking back up on the mission of God, and how have we been defining the mission of God? You've been awake the last few weeks. What is God's mission?
He's in the mission of restoring.
Restoring what?
Well, that's a good question, man. Restoring from the standpoint is really, we could get bogged down in talking about he's going to restore this and now he's going to restore restore that. But the real thing that he's trying to restore is mankind's relationship with him.
Yeah, and we've just been defining it as his reign, right? God's reign, God's kingdom. And we saw from the beginning that this was the case. When God created the earth, everything was under his subjection. And it was very good. But quickly, just a couple chapters in, it started to break down. Rebellion began to happen with this serpent creature, this spiritual being in the garden, and with humanity. And in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, this gets out of control really quickly. There's murder, there is polygamy, there is a constant struggle to be like God instead of being made in God's image. And so we get to chapter 12, what we talked about last week, and God decides to do something different. Right? He chooses from all the nations. Genesis 11, we left off with the Tower of Babel, and its focus was on all the nations of the world and the scattering of all the nations. And out of those many nations, God chooses one person. And that's this person, Abram. And he's going to start this process of restoration, restoring God's reign over the earth. And this is the call to Abraham that we looked at last week. He's going to bless him. But importantly, we looked at the fact that it's blessing for a purpose. It's not just so Abraham and his family can hoard the blessings, right? God says, I'm going to bless you so that you will be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. And in you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And this becomes true. Abraham is the father of many nations, right? And the rest of Genesis chronicles the children that he has, right? He has a son, Isaac, and Isaac has a son, Jacob, and Jacob has a son, Joseph, and that covers the rest of Genesis. And this blessing comes true. Abraham is given this flourishing family. He prospers at what he does. The people that bless him are blessed, like God said, and the people that curse him are cursed, like God said. So we get to, right?
They're all still Jews, though. They're not any nation at that point.
Correct.
He was a Jew and all his
Yes.
descendants were
Yes.
Jews, so at that point, there still was one piece.
Right. Yeah, and that's, we looked last week at, it's kind of this hourglass shape, right? Genesis 1 through 11 starts out with this broad focus. And then we get to chapter 12, and it's this single point with Abraham. And then he begins the process of bringing the blessing to all the nations. So right now we're focused on Abraham and his family. In the back of our mind, we have to keep in mind that it's for the purpose of the rest of the nations. So Abraham
We could say that, Pharaoh got to understand who the true and the living
Yes.
God was as a result of Abraham and what happened with Abraham and Sarah. And Abimelech, who was the leader of the Philistines, came to understand who the true and the living God was as well.
Yes.
That's a byproduct.
Yes, blessing and curses, right? And we're going to see that today as we look at Exodus. So we get Abraham, his grandson, Jacob. During the time of Jacob, there was a famine in the land. And just as a side note, every time we see famine, every time we see barrenness either in the earth or in the womb, it's a reminder that things aren't the way God intended them to be, right? There was flourishing when God created the earth. And now there's things like barrenness, and there's things like famine. And so, in the time of Jacob, Abraham's grandson, there's a famine in the land. And through God's providence, Joseph, Abraham's great-grandson, ends up in Egypt. And he becomes second in Egypt only to Pharaoh. And God uses this to bless first Abraham, but also the nation of Egypt, right? It's through Joseph that Egypt is able to survive the famine as well, and his wisdom. So this is an example of what God promised. The nations who bless you, I'm going to bless. And so the Israelites now, this family of Abraham, are living in Egypt, and they're doing great. The beginning of Exodus says all the descendants of Jacob, who is later named Israel, so that's where we get the term Israelite from. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. And Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all of his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now this should ring a bell to us, because we've seen this with Adam and Eve, we saw this with Noah, and we saw this with Abraham. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the land, right? We turn to Exodus 1, and it's happened, right? There's this at least partial fulfillment of God's blessing on Abraham. I'm going to make you a great nation. You're going to be fruitful and multiply and fill the land. And this is great, right? It wasn't great to everyone, though. There arose a king over Egypt who didn't know Joseph. Remember, Joseph had been a blessing to the nation of Egypt. It helped save it from famine. It had been a valuable resource for Egypt. But after a few years, as we understand, generations pass and you forget people. And now they didn't see the Israelites as a blessing. They saw them as just a group of immigrants that are starting to outnumber the natural citizens. And we see all the time frustrations about that and concerns about that in our own country. And that's what's going on here. We're not so sure about these Israelites. They're starting to outnumber our own people. And what he's afraid of is if they decide they don't like us, they can band together and overthrow us, right? They have enough people that they can make an army and overthrow the Egyptian government. So to prevent an uprising, ironically, the Pharaoh decides to make the people slaves. They ruthlessly made people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. So the idea is we can suppress these people so there's no chance of them ever rebelling against us. If we put them in servitude, they won't have the power. So they become slaves, and the more they're persecuted, the more they multiply. And they begin to cry out to God under their oppression. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of the slavery, and they cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard the groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. I love this expression. This is not a distant God. This is a God who is genuinely concerned about the welfare of his people. He heard their cries, he saw them, and he knew. And so we're getting into the story of the Exodus. And this is the story where the family of Abraham becomes a people, and they become a nation. And so in the book of Exodus, we're going to learn, first of all, about the identity of God. He identifies himself as Yahweh. But we're also going to learn the identity of Israel. And first of all, Israel is going to be a redeemed people. He hears their cry while they're in slavery. They've been oppressed for years. God remembers that covenant he made with Abraham. And he says to Moses, who's going to kind of lead this charge, he says to Moses, "Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, I am Yahweh, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment." This is going to be the first marker of Israel's identity, is they're going to be a saved and a redeemed people. So what does it mean to redeem? It's not a word we use often. Okay? Buy back. Okay? Yeah, that's great. Anyone else want to add to that? Buy back, exactly. You see, in Leviticus, there's a law about redeeming someone. You may have heard the term kinsman redeemer, right? This is what the law says. If a stranger or a sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor, and sells him to the stranger or the sojourner with you, to a member of the stranger's clan, then after he is sold, he may be redeemed, bought back. One of his brothers may buy him back, redeem him, or his uncle or his cousin may redeem him, or a close relative from his clan may redeem him. Or if he grows rich, he may redeem himself. So who is God buying Israel back from in this story? Because he says he's going to redeem them. Who owns Israel right now? Egypt. Yeah. Egypt. And God says, say to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord Yahweh, Israel is my firstborn son. And I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me." Right? This is the same idea of the kinsman redeemer. God's son is in captivity. And God says, I'm going to buy my son back. This is my firstborn son. I'm going to buy him back out of slavery.
Well, that's true on one level. Mm-hmm. The highest level is he wants Israel to come back and acknowledge him as the great I am, and to be reconciled in a spiritual relationship with him. And I guess that's where you're going.
Yeah. And they're not free to do that in Egypt, right? But there's a loss of their identity as they're in Egypt for 400 years, right? So he tells the people, I've observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. This is the last part of God's covenant with Abraham, is I'm going to bring you into a land, right? And it's been delayed. God says, I'm going to make that happen. So he's in redeeming his people, he's going to bless them. He's going to save them. But look at this. The next verse says, you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we might sacrifice to the Lord our God. So they're saved, but they're saved for something. Just how Abraham was blessed in order to bless, Israel is going to be saved in order to serve, right? First of all, it says to serve the Lord our God. I want you to be redeemed in order so that you can go to Mount Sinai and worship me. And that's kind of what Bobby was saying, is so we can be reunited, so my people can come and serve me. And so this is when we get all the Charlton Heston Ten Commandment fun storybook Exodus stories, right? There's the 10 plagues. The Pharaoh says, I'm not going to let these people go. And so there's 10 plagues that interestingly, a lot of people think that these plagues correspond to the gods of Egypt. God says, I'm going to execute judgment not just on Egypt and Pharaoh, but on the gods of Egypt. So if you look at the plagues, there's a correspondence between the plagues and the gods. For instance, the Nile was considered to be a god in Egypt. So what does God, the real God, do? He turns the Nile to blood, right? And so God delivers his people out of Egypt with a mighty hand, like he promised. Parts the Red Sea.
You watch the King of Kings.
What's that?
Every time I watch it, I think, these special effects from 1956 are awesome.
Yes. It's a classic. It's a classic. So God delivers Israel out of Egypt with a mighty hand, the crossing of the Red Sea, in order to go to Mount Sinai to worship God. And Mount Sinai is going to be very important, and that gets us to this second identity of Israel, is that Israel is a covenant people. And this covenant takes place at Mount Sinai. Covenant, we mentioned briefly last week with Abraham. Right? God makes a covenant with him. But this is a really important concept for us to grasp. It's all throughout the Bible. In fact, we call the Bible the Old Testament and the New Testament, or the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, right? This is the central way that the Bible describes God's relationship with his people. It's this idea of covenant. So we should know what a covenant is, shouldn't we? You don't have to, these technical words, this is a suzerain vassal treaty. In the ancient world, in Israel's neighbors, there were these kind of political treaties between two different nations. And a lot of times what would happen is a more powerful nation would conquer a smaller nation, or they'd make an alliance with a smaller nation. And so there would be a relationship between those two. And the suzerain was the more powerful king. It was kind of the overlord, whereas the vassal was the weaker kingdom. And so they would make a treaty with each other, and they would pledge their loyalty to each other. And the vassal, the weaker nation, would say, I will be loyal to you if you protect me, right? I'm going to make an alliance with you. And we see this in Kings and Chronicles. I think the kingdom of Israel makes an alliance with Assyria, right, for protection. And
Didn't do much good.
it didn't do them, no.
They depended on the wrong people.
That's right.
The wrong person.
That's right. So the thing about these were, there were stipulations for this, right? Anytime you have a contract, a treaty, there are stipulations. And as long as the vassal abided by those stipulations, he was in the suzerain's good graces, and the suzerain would bless him. But if he broke his part of the agreement, then there were curses built in to the treaty. And so if he broke them, he would be subject to those curses. So there's been archaeological discoveries, and this is, I think, is interesting, is the parts of this treaty. There's kind of a set formula for these treaties, and they have mapped this the form of this treaty onto the entire book of Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is one big suzerain vassal treaty. And so this is the relationship that Yahweh is going to make with his people. He's going to be the suzerain. He's going to be the more powerful king, obviously. He says, I'm going to invite you into this relationship. Family of Abraham, or the nation of Israel. And what that means for the mission of God, God is reigning, but he invites the nation of Israel to join him in that. They're subject to him, but they're ruling on his behalf, as a vassal would do. Does that make sense? Have I lost anyone yet? Okay. So it's a relationship. And when we think about covenant, we think about relationships. About the only time we use covenant nowadays is in what? Marriage, right? Which is a relationship. It's really this political treaty between two parties, isn't it? Right? And there are vows, there are stipulations. And this is what God says to Israel. I'm going to take you to be my people, and I'm going to be your God. This is our relationship. And just a side note, God does use the metaphor of marriage with Israel quite a bit, right? Which is another type of covenant. So he's in this relationship with the nation of Israel. And this is what it looks like. He says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." This is the invitation into covenant. In those suzerain vassal treaties, they would always begin with this prologue of their relationship. Right? The king would say, "Remember what I did for you." And that's what God is doing here. I delivered you out of Egypt. And based on that pre-existent relationship, let's make a pact. Right? Now notice this is conditional. Right? That if-then language. He says, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession. Right? So this is a voluntary agreement that the nation of Israel commits to.
Yeah, verse 8, they made the commitment. It didn't take very long for the commitment to be broken.
Exactly.
God is faithful with his covenant, but it is amazing. He already knew what was going to happen with Israel. He'd already prepared the way through Christ in order not only to give them the opportunity for reconciliation, but all the world.
Yeah.
And his foreknowledge,
Yeah.
still allowing choice.
Yeah. They're quickly going to break this. Moses doesn't get off Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments before they break them, right? So, and isn't that just human nature?
All at one time.
Yeah, they're good at that. So he says, if we're going to be in this relationship, you're going to be a kingdom under me. You're going to be part of my reign. I'm going to make you a kingdom of priests. What does it mean to be a kingdom of priests? And we should know, this is important to know because Peter in 1 Peter is going to quote Exodus 19, and he's going to apply it to the Gentile Christians. He says, "You are a holy priesthood." So it's important that we understand what God means by a kingdom of priests.
Well, I think first you got to realize under the old law,
Mm-hmm.
they had to go through the priests.
Mm-hmm.
The law specified sacrifices.
Yeah.
But then Christ came, that system was done away with. And then we can all be our own priests because we can go directly to God through Christ.
Yeah,
We
exactly.
don't have to have an earthly priest.
So that raises the question, what is the function of a priest in the first place?
It's a emissary to God.
What is that?
Emissary.
Emissary to God, you said? A mediator? Intermediary. Yeah. Right? It goes between humanity and God. So then what does it mean for Israel to be a kingdom of priests?
They should have been ambassadors to the Gentile nations.
Yes. They should have been ambassadors to the Gentile nations. They are intermediaries between God and the people. So what we saw in Genesis 12 is the fact that through Abraham's descendants, all nations are going to be blessed. And here we see in Exodus 19, we get a picture of how this is supposed to be done, right? You're supposed to represent me to the Gentiles. And what this looks like, in part, we see in Deuteronomy chapter 4. He's talking about the commandments of the law. And he says, "Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples." the nations, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation, talking about Israel, is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us, whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this law that I set before you today? So part of the function of Israel keeping the laws was to reflect God's character to the rest of the world. He says, by doing this, they'll say, this is a great nation. This is a wise nation. Their God is close to them. And the implication is they'll want to join in, right? This was how they were to be a kingdom of priests. Brian, we just say something? Did I cut you off? No, I'm hearing things. Right, so not only is Israel saved in order to serve God, they're saved in order to serve other people. And this is important for us as Christians. As I mentioned, 1 Peter 2, he says that you are a kingdom of priests. You are a royal priesthood. And so we have that same function of representing God. As we looked at last week, the idea that the election of one is for the salvation of all, right? It's not to be hoarded. It's for a purpose. And we see that. And we keep going back to this idea of commission, to reign with God. And this is what Israel does as God's covenant people, right? He joins in with God's reign, and they start, in theory, are supposed to teach others what it looks like when God is in charge, right? They're supposed to model what it looks like to treat others the right way. We have all these laws, and part of the reason is that the rest of the world can look at them and say, I like the way they're doing it, right? Take the Sabbath, for instance. They're not working all the time like every other nation on earth is. They've got a period of rest. They take care of their animals. They take care of one another, right? And so they're representing God to the rest of the world. And this is what Bobby pointed out. They agree to this, right? A covenant is voluntary. You sign up for it. So Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. And the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. All the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So they agree to the terms and conditions of this covenant. And that's going to be important when we get into the prophets, because the prophets are going to hold them accountable for what they signed up for. There are some pretty harsh things that happened to the nation of Israel, including captivity, that seem cruel on God's behalf. But what we realize, if we read the book of Deuteronomy, is Israel knew the terms and conditions, and they agreed to it happily. Right? This shouldn't have been a surprise to them. This is what they signed up for. And so they knew the commitment that they had made when they joined into covenant with him. Right? And we're going to look at that.
God actually carries out the covenant that he made through them by them going into captivity, because they became a light to many of the nations throughout the Babylonian Empire. Had the synagogues built, and then, of course, there was a group that recommitted to him, and that Jesus comes through the remnant.
Yeah. Again, there's that providence, right? So he says, I'm going to make you into a kingdom of priests. And then he says, I'm going to also make you into a holy nation. And that's the third identity that we really see in the book of Exodus. Israel is a holy people. What does it mean to be holy? Set apart. Different, okay.
Sanctified.
Okay.
Set apart.
Yeah, set apart. In what way? Because you can be weird and different in that way and not be holy. I was called holy many times growing up. what kind of separation are we talking about? Set apart from the world? Yeah. And when we talk about the holiness of God, there's this transcendence, right? There's the common, the normal, and then God is above all that, right? And so when we pray in the Lord's Prayer, hallowed be your name, or holy be your name, we're saying we want to magnify it. Your name is transcendent, and we want to live that out. Your name is not common. You are not like everything else. Everything else is creation. You are creator. And so there's really two reasons then that Israel is called to be a holy nation. The first one is what we talked about, is they're representatives of God. So in Leviticus 19, God says, "Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord, your God, am holy." This idea of an ambassador, or what's the word you use? Emissary? Emissary, yeah. The idea that we are representing God's kingdom, right?
People should see a difference.
Yeah.
I'm really old, so when Arlene and I were dating, we went to Opryland.
Mm-hmm.
But it did. It was a theme party. And we ate a meal, and we were sitting there, and we prayed before our meal. And literally, people came up to us and said, "Thank you." But it was different.
Yeah.
People didn't do it in public. Pray for a meal in public.
Yeah.
You want to be holy, that you're set apart, and the world can see that you're not weird.
Yeah.
It may be weird to them. It may feel weird sometimes, but your weirdness is to honor God.
Yeah.
Not to just be strange.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the term countercultural, right? We don't go along with the grain. Greg says it a lot, and I like the way he puts it, is we can teach people that there's a different way to live, right? There's not just the way that we see on TV. There's another and a better way, and that's what this gets at. If God is holy, and we are God's covenant people, that means we should be holy too. We should reflect His character. The opposite of this is the third commandment, right? When God says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." So a lot of times we think this means, to swear or whatever. But really a big part of what this means is to make God's name common, to give it a bad reputation. And we don't have to say, OMG to get that across, right? If we are representing God or claim to be representing God and we're living like heathens, we've used his name in vain. We're misrepresenting who God is, right? We're bearing that flag, but we're not acting like the nation it represents.
So often through Proverbs, it speaks to the value of a name.
Yeah.
Name was really important for Israel.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just your dad's name, it was a lineage of name.
Yeah.
That Jesus is the Davidic king means something to us. A name is very important to the Jewish people. It's because God set name up at the beginning.
Yeah. It represents character, doesn't it? And that's why we see in the Psalms the name of God is praised just like God himself. Because the name is as good as the person behind it, right?
God is telling them to do what's in their best interest,
Mm-hmm.
or not to do what's in their best interest. And you see it over and over again throughout the New Testament. You see the results like Tim's talking about in Proverbs.
Mm-hmm.
So why do we do the same thing?
Yeah. Good question.
We try to do good by it. But there's no good in us. No, not. Even one.
Filthy rags.
None of you are good.
Well, that's Paul talking in Romans chapter 3 before they were born again. And then he talks about the life that we do need to live. But out back to the idea of blood and ongoing sanctification, as we seek to walk in the life we are made pure before God. We were justified through the blood too. But really, you think about it, everything he asks us to do is in our best interest, and everything he tells us not to do is in our best interest not to do, right?
There we go, keep doing.
The human condition. By the way, Israel doesn't keep God's name holy. They are not a holy people. They don't set themselves apart from the rest of the nations, and they take his name in vain. And we see this in Ezekiel, which Paul quotes in Romans. God says, I will vindicate the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, and which you have profaned among them. Paul quotes this and says, my name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Right? Because you're acting not like my people. You're not resembling my character at all. So the first reason that Israel is called to be a holy nation is because they're representing God himself. And if God is holy, his people ought to be holy as well.
Ziegler had a saying that so many people don't come to church because there's so many hypocrites in the church.
Yeah.
And he says, that's okay, we have room for one more hypocrite.
Room for one more hypocrite. The second reason that Israel is called to be a holy nation is because God says, I'm going to come live with you. And this is big. It says, I'm going to dwell among the people of Israel, and I will be their God. And they shall know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God. So here we see both that redemption aspect, they're a redeemed people. I brought them out of the land of Egypt. We see that covenant aspect. I am their God. He says, I'm going to come and live among them. And this is a beautiful idea, right? Isn't this the goal? Isn't that what you said, Bobby? Is our goal is to be back in relationship with God so that we can live in the presence of God. Right? This is what Eden is all about, is humanity dwelling with God. Even the tabernacle, some of the imagery within it is reflective of Eden. Right? There's cherubim and the curtains that are before the most holy place. So this is kind of this portable Eden. So this is great, but there's one problem, is God's holiness is extremely dangerous. Yes, and that's exactly. What's going on in that story is that they are not making the distinguishment between holy and common. They go and get this unauthorized fire, this common fire from a source other than what God has ordained. It's unclean. And disaster happens. A professor that said God is a live wire, right? And so you better have, be wearing a rubber costume or whatever, rubber uniform, if you're going to come in contact with pure electricity. God is energy. And so you need to be in the right disposition in order to be in the presence of a holy God, right? And we don't think about that a lot. It's a beautiful thought to dwell in the presence of God, but it's also terrifying. I was so tempted to put the picture from Raiders of the Lost Ark where the guy's face melts when he touches the Ark of the Covenant. Because that's really the idea, is God is powerful. His holiness is powerful. And if you are not also in a state of holiness, it's devastating. And we see that time and time again. So the identity of Israel as a nation is they are redeemed for a purpose. They are saved in order to serve. They're to be representatives of God, a holy priesthood, or a nation of priests. And they're to be a holy nation, right? And we're going to, I'll just spoil it for you, they don't live out this identity well at all. They're going to botch this miserably. But we're going to look at that next week. So thank you for your attention.